In this video, we are going to cover the behavioral perspectives, the humanistic perspectives, and the contemporary perspectives on personality development. Now, behaviorism is based off of the idea that we learn through our environment, right? We respond to stimuli, and then we either get reinforced or we get punished, right? So those are the basis of operant conditioning, right, which we learned from Skinner. So the behaviors believe in determinism, that we don't have any free will, that all of our behavior are just responses to our environment, that we don't have any control over how we respond, right? And so then response tendencies are then just the patterns of behaviors that we have learned to do, right? You've learned how to behave and respond a certain way to a specific stimuli. Okay, and then this becomes the basis of your personality. Excuse me. So this is based on operant conditioning. Again, behaviors that are punished are meant to be stopped. Behaviors that are reinforced are meant to continue. And then extinction is just the natural ending of a behavior when it's no longer reinforced. Okay, so we're always having then different personalities according to behaviorism, because you're constantly having new experiences and learning new things, and therefore learning new responses. And then our behavior is, they say, conditioned mechanically in quotes, because again, we don't have, according to them, any awareness or any control that this is what's happening. Now, this is an example of how behavior is reinforced or punished through your environment, and then that lends to your personality, right? So if someone tells a joke and the people they're telling the joke to laugh, they compliment them, right? That behavior of telling a joke is reinforced, so they're more likely to tell jokes in the future, right? And then the opposite is true. If they tell a joke and it falls flat, nobody laughs, they think it's stupid, and they tell them that, then they are less likely to tell jokes in the future as well. Now, Bandura, if you remember, but his idea of how we learn is through observation, right? And so, of course, then that's the same way that he believes we develop personality. Now, he believes in reciprocal determinism, meaning that our environment does affect our behavior, but our behavior can have an effect on our environment. However, it's still out of our control, right? He just says that it goes both ways, but we don't have any control over our behavior. But our behavior will have an effect on our environment, right? So observational learning, we learn through models and imitation, if you remember the Bobo doll experiment, right? So we watch other people do things, and we can see if they get reinforced or if they get punished. So we can learn a response set by just watching. We don't actually have to carry out the behavior. Now, Bandura also came up with the idea of self-efficacy. This is just how capable you think you are. If you have high self-efficacy, you have high confidence in your skills and capabilities, and you're more likely to work harder and try at something to try to ensure that you succeed. Versus if you have low self-efficacy, right, you're less likely to actually try hard because you don't believe that you can do it anyway, right? So it's kind of like your self-confidence in your abilities. Now, Mitchell's person, situation, controversy. So he focused less on the person. He believed that the different factors of a situation are going to influence our behavior and not our personality. So our personality has less to do with our responses. It's again more focused on the environment and the actual stimulus that's going to cause a response. Now, the good and the bad. So the good things about the behavioral perspective is that it is based on research. If you remember, behaviorism criticized analysis because you couldn't really study the unconscious. So then behaviorism said you should only study what you can see, observable behavior. So it is based on research, and they do place an emphasis on the environment and situations and how that can change and influence our behavior. The cons are that then it's dehumanizing, right? We don't have free will to change our behavior, to have control over our behavior, right? And they're very dependent on animal research, right? There's very little research that you can do with humans, and even the research that you can do with animals is limited as well. And therefore, you can't always generalize the behavior of animals to humans, right? They're not always a one-to-one thing, right? Rats may do something and humans may not do that, okay? And then when they say they have a fragmented view of personality, basically there's no one single trait or one single way that they connect all these different response tendencies, right? Their basis is just that we respond to stimuli in our environment, but they don't really go any further than that. The humanistic perspective has always been the most optimistic perspective, right? So people have control, right? This was a response to behaviorism and psychoanalysis that said we don't have any control. Humanistic perspective says, yes, we actually do. We are the ones who make decisions on our behavior, right? So then our subjective views, the fact that everyone views the world a little bit differently, is going to influence our behavior as well. And that makes it a person-centered theory, right? They're focusing more on our interpretations and our perception of the world, because that is going to determine how you respond to your environment. If you see your environment as threatening, you're more likely to be cautious or try to escape. Whereas if you see your environment as fun, you're more likely to want to stay and hang out and engage. So the humanistic perspective also came up with the idea of your self-concept, right? So you have a collection of beliefs about yourself, your self-image, basically who you think you are, right? Now, when we're talking about incongruence, so you can either be congruent or incongruent. If you're congruent, what you think about yourself is also the reality about yourself. When you're incongruent, what you think about yourself is not at all what the reality is, right? So there's a disparity between your opinion of yourself and what you're actually like, okay? So the more incongruent you are, the more anxiety you have, and then the more defensive behavior you show to try to protect your self-image, right? Because no one likes to be called out for doing bad things. So if you get called out and you're like, no, I'm not like that, right? You get defensive. So they believe that this stems from either receiving conditional or unconditional positive regard as a child. So if you remember, conditional positive regard is that you have to meet certain criteria in order to get love and acceptance. And then unconditional, just because you are a person, you deserve love and acceptance, right? No matter what. And then this is obviously then determined by your parents. So if your parents gave you unconditional positive regard, then you are more likely to have congruence, because you learn that it is okay to have flaws. It is okay to make mistakes, right? We're all learning and growing, okay? Versus if they gave you conditional positive regard, right, you're more likely to then have incongruence, because you depend on others to give you acceptance, and you feel like you're always having to meet a certain standard, right? You can't just be yourself. So as you can see here, incongruence, right, your self-concept and what you're actually like are pretty much almost the same, right? There's a lot of overlap. There's always going to be a little bit of yourself that may not be exactly with reality, right? Sometimes we think too highly or too low of ourselves, right? But for the most part, what you think of yourself and what you're actually like is generally the same, right? Incongruence is when your self-concept and what you're actually like have almost no overlap, right? So there is very little congruence happening, and this causes a lot of anxiety. Now, Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. So the basic idea is that you need to meet certain needs in your life before you can reach what he calls self-actualization. Okay? He believed that all humans have an innate drive for personal growth, right? That we're always trying to become better versions of ourselves, right? Which then leads to self-actualization, where you fulfill your potential in every aspect of your life. Right? So he believed that self-actualized people have these healthy personalities where they are spontaneous and creative, and courageous, right? And they continue to seek personal growth. And then that is the basis of your personality. You always trying to grow and be better, right? According to Maslow. And here you have the famous pyramid where the bottom layers are your existing needs, right? So these needs have to be met before you can start worrying about your personal growth needs. Right, so if you are at one of the upper levels and let's say you suddenly lose your job, right, so now you've lost safety and security, right, you no longer have a steady income. So Maslow believed that you are then bumped back down to this level until that need is fulfilled, and then you have to work your way back up again. So kind of like when you're playing Jenga, if you pull out one of the lower blocks, the whole tower falls over, you have to start all over again. So once again, the pros and the cons. So the good thing about the humanistic perspective, the pros, is that it gives humans control over their behavior, right? That we have conscious control over what it is that we do. It also brought about the idea of the self-concept and how that can provide us either with anxiety, congruence or incongruence. And then this is where we get positive psychology, right? Treating people with unconditional positive regard. Now, the cons is that this, like the psychoanalytic perspective, has poor testability, right? Because it is very, very subjective on what personal growth is and what that looks like from person to person. So then it's very hard to compare people as well. And there's an unrealistic view on humans as well. Maslow couldn't even come up with examples of self-actualized people. So it sets this kind of unrealistic standard that people are expected to meet. And then there's inadequate evidence because there's not a lot of research that can be done, again, because of its poor testability. So there's not a lot of supporting evidence for it. In the biological perspective, we have Eysenk's theory, right? So he narrowed down our personality core traits to 3. So you either have high or low levels of extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. So within psychoticism, you have egocentrism, impulsiveness, and different levels of how antisocial someone can be, right? So he believed that some people are more what he calls conditionable than others, right? Basically, the way to think about this is how sensitive someone is. The more sensitive someone is, the more likely that they're going to be affected by responses to their behavior, right? The less sensitive someone is, the less likely that other people's behavior will influence them. So for example, someone who has high sensitivity, right? Let's say they make that joke, the joke falls flat, nobody laughs, they are more likely to then not make the joke, right? Again, or to joke at all. Versus someone who is less sensitive, if they make a joke and it doesn't really go over well, it won't really bother them. They'll continue to say that joke or say different jokes, right? So they are less likely to have their behavior regulated by that, right? So high arousability is basically how sensitive someone is. Twin studies have allowed us to see that there's a lot of personality traits that are inherited because identical twins show higher similarities. There's a 5% concordance rate as compared to fraternal twins, which are basically siblings who have only about 1 to 2% concordance rate when measured across personality. So this shows us that there is a high heritability in personality traits because twins are far more likely, when they have the same exact DNA, to have very similar personalities. Right? So this debunks some of the myth of the shared environment, that your environment is going to have a direct impact on your personality. Because then, if that were 100% true, you and your siblings, right, or siblings in general, would have the same exact personalities because you're living in the same environment, right? You're sharing the same environment, so it would be expected that you all have the same personality, and that is very rarely true, right? And so through genetic mapping, we have found some links between genes and extroversion, but the evidence isn't conclusive because it's very hard to actually determine which genes are causing which traits, right? Because there's so many combinations that could happen, so it's almost impossible to replicate all these different combinations to get the same trait of extroversion. As you can see here in this graph, right, the yellow is the identical twins, the orange is fraternal twins, which are basically siblings, right? And so identical twins have a higher correlation in terms of the 5-factor traits when it's measured across the board. They are more likely to share similar traits versus fraternal twins. So now the pros and the cons of the biological perspective. So the pros are that we were able to see how there is genetic influence on our personality, right? That our genes can determine some of our personality. The cons are that we don't know how much, basically. So our heritability estimates are not accurate. That basically means how accurate we think we are when we're saying like this trait is more heritable over another. And then it's just very hard to separate your genes from your environment, right, to determine which one has more of an influence. So in the end, we say that it's both. It's a reciprocal relationship. They both affect each other no matter what. So narcissism has to do with basically a person being completely self-absorbed, that they're the only thing that matters. Everything they do is a means to an end, right? So when you first meet someone who has high narcissistic tendencies, they at first seem charming, right? Because they want to use everyone for their own benefit. So they want everyone to like them, so that way they can take advantage of that. So at first, they're very charming, very friendly, very charismatic, okay? But the more time that people spend with them, they realize that they are complete narcissists, right? They're totally obsessed with themselves and don't care how their actions are going to affect the people around them. Now, there have been studies that say that narcissism is a lot higher in the younger generations than it is in the older generations. And there's no real explanation for this, right? There could be a lot of different causes. So it's not to say that it's 100% on them, that it's their fault that they're narcissistic, right? Social media has a big impact on it, right? The models that they have, meaning like the people that they're observing and things like that, right? And also who's raising them. So it's just interesting to see that this is what has come about. Now, the problem with that is that there's a bigger concern in the younger generations for looking a certain way and being physically attractive, right? Having a specific body type and look. And then this also increases materialism, right? That we all have to have and own certain things in order to be worthy, I guess you could say. But this then leads to overconsumption of resources, right? Natural resources. And the earth only has a limited amount. And if we're not replacing it, then things are not looking good, right? So there's just a growing concern over how this increase in narcissism can lead to other negative impacts. The terror management theory is basically centered around the idea that human beings are aware, right? We know that one day we're going to die, right? So usually it's not something that we think about very often. It's not usually at the forefront of our mind, but this knowledge can affect and does affect our behaviors and our personalities, right? So this affects what we call our self-preservation instinct, right? The fact that we want to survive and stay alive, right? Evolutionarily, we have this instinct, and that has been what has kept us and other animals, right, alive, right? The need to survive. So a way that we deal with the anxiety and terror, right, of knowing that we're going to die someday, one of the ways that we cope with that is with culture, right? So having religions to explain what it is that happens after we die, what's our purpose in life, right? So that brings us some comfort from the terror and the anxiety, right? And then self-esteem is a little bit more personal, right? So if you feel like your life has worth, if you have worth, then you are more likely to want to live and survive. So it helps also to manage that terror. Mortality salience is basically the degree to which a person is aware of their death, right? How much are they thinking about it? How consciously aware are they? Right, so most of us have very low morality salience because, again, we're not constantly thinking about the fact that we're going to die someday, right? But when you ask people to think about it, right, you increase the morality salience, and it has some interesting effects on our behavior, right? People tend to then give harsher punishments if they're asked to think about, you know, their death before giving like punishment sentences. It increases patriotism, racism, prejudice, and hostility to opposing views because we become defensive against others and unknowns, right? So we become more defensive on the things that we believe in, right? We take a harsher stance against the others because it goes against what we think and it goes against, you know, familiarity. So it helps protect us in thinking that, you know, what we think has values, what we do has values, again, to protect against that fear of the death.